Hello, my name is Roisin and I'm sick of reading. As I'm new to BookTube, I thought it would be a good idea to introduce you to my taste by talking about some of my favourite books of all time. I've split this into two categories, so I have my favourite childhood books of all time, books that hold a special place in my heart because I read them when I was young and impressionable, and then books that I read when I was maybe 15 and older that I love so much, and that may tell you more about my taste now as an adult. The childhood books I adore but aren't necessarily in the same bracket. So I've got 5 books in my childhood books of all time, but 2 are series, so I've actually got like 13 books in my favourite childhood books. So the first one, very obvious, I was born in the 90s, and one of my favourite childhood books of all time is Harry Potter. Like, I feel like I couldn't not mention it, and while obviously J.K. Rowling is questionable at best, there's just something about the world, and the first 2 were read to me by my mum when I was like 5 years old. It's a security blanket, it's a cosy place where I know the world. The fact that it was all spread out throughout my childhood, so you know, they were all coming out year after year, and then slowly then it was like 2 years, and then it was like 3 years, so there was weight, so that it stretched from my childhood from when I was 5 to when I was like 14 or 15 with the books until I was like 18 with the movies. I know that's not an original thought, most people of my generation have the same experience with Harry Potter, but I couldn't leave it off the list. The second one on my list, again, is very popular, and it's Historic Materials Trilogy by Philip Pullman. Again, another young fantasy series, and I read these ones, I read all 3 of them back to back, I think, and fell in love with the world. I think I understood the resonances of Christianity and the church and the controlling nature of certain churches and things when I first read it, but I don't think I got the extent of all the imagery and all the ideas until I read it again when I was a bit older. But I mean, I want a polar bear as a best friend, and that's sort of the historical nature. So the Lyra's world is obviously parallel to our world, but it's not the same because it's sort of a steampunk version of our world. It's almost late Victorian, and then they've got the magical element of demons and talking bears and aeronauts, which I know are real, but you know, people don't usually travel that much by balloon in our world, and witches. So that is something that you will see is part of my taste now, things that are historical fiction with that kind of magical element but not high fantasy. That's something that I just can't get enough of, and I think that love affair began with Historic Material. Next one on my list is Little Women. Now, I haven't actually seen the 2019 version of Little Women that's out at the moment, but I really want to. I saw the 1994 version with Winona Ryder first. That was my first introduction to Little Women, but then I used to get the audiobooks out on tape from my library, and I remember getting Little Women out on tape, and it stopped when their father came back from the war, and I was so confused. I was like, where's the rest of it? In the UK it was published in 2 halves, Little Women and Good Wives, because there is a bit in the book where it like leaps forward in time. I felt such a kinship with Jo as someone who wants to be a writer, as someone who feels awkward and uncomfortable and doesn't fit and doesn't feel comfortable with the expectations placed upon her. I mean, I think lots of people feel the same. That is one of the reasons it's such an enduring story. Although, I did a quiz for which sister are you. I got equal parts Jo and Amy, which, I mean, makes a lot of sense for me. Also, Christian Bale in the 1994 version was my first ever crush. Christian Bale now, not so much, but I loved Laurie so much. Next on my list is I Kept a Castle by Dodie Smith. Again, I think I saw the film of this first with Romola Garai and Henry Cavill, another gorgeous man, and I fell in love with it. I thought it was an amazing, beautiful story. I loved it so much, and then I read the book and I was just captivated. Any story with families, oddball families in strange situations, sisters especially. I don't have any sisters, but I always wished I did. With sort of domestic adventure, someone who's a writer and doesn't quite fit in. You know, it's the same thing, and I love it. And it's almost as if, it's almost like Jane Austen meets the Famous Five. That maybe doesn't make any sense. There's no like actual mystery solving or anything, but I guess it's because it's set in the 1930s. This family, where the father is a famous writer, they rent this castle, and then he doesn't write any more books, and they lose a lot of money, and they're poor. They're like properly poor, not like Jane Austen poor. And then the man who owns the house on which the castle dies, and his 2 grandsons come over from America, and the 2 sisters meet them, and hijinks ensue. But it's not as straightforward as a Jane Austen romance. Now, I'm not disparaging Jane Austen, she is on my list in a minute, but the confusing, difficult to understand feelings of being 17 and not knowing what is what you feel and what you think is right, and it's all just really, really well done. And that's by Dodie Smith. She wrote 101 Dalmatians as well. As I mentioned, Jane Austen was on my list, and my final book from my childhood favourites is Pride and Prejudice. I couldn't leave it out. I read all of Jane Austen's books when I was about 11 or 12, and although I do love all of them, and I'm not sure that I would, hard to pick a favourite because they all kind of go together, even though they're not a series, they almost feel like a series to me. I had to pick Pride and Prejudice because the BBC miniseries was 6 hours long and we had it on videotape. It was on 2 videotapes, and me and my brother would just watch it over and over. We'd spend all of a Sunday just watching all 6 hours. When I was like 7 and he was 5, that was all we did. We loved Pride and Prejudice so much. And again, Lizzie Bennet. Like, if I was to think about the sort of fictional characters that I resonated with and also wanted to be, Jo March from Little Women, Cassandra Mortmain from I Captured the Castle, and Lizzie Bennet from Pride and Prejudice. Even though I'm not like all of them exactly, you couldn't be, they're different, but they're in my head, I suppose. They've stuck with me whilst I was developing my personality. So that is all of my childhood favourites. I'm going to move on to adult favourites, but first I'm going to get rid of these hiccups. Right, I think I've cured those hiccups now, so we can move on with my favourite books of adulthood. These are in no particular order. I just wrote them down as they popped into my head. The first ones happen to be the ones I've read most recently, but have still made it onto my list. So the first one on this list is The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock by Imogen Hermes Gower, which, if you watched my favourite books of 2019, you would have heard me gush about. It's set in 18th century London and is about a merchant whose captain comes home from the east with a curiosity. He sold everything on their ship in exchange for this mermaid, and it's described as looking a bit like a monkey sewn onto a fish, and he decides to display it. The other main character is Angelica. She's a courtesan whose sugar daddy has recently died. I don't know the proper 18th century term for sugar daddy, but he's recently died and she's had to find a new way to make money. She's resisting going back to her old madam. She does actually, near the beginning of the book, end up having to go back to her. What I love about this book is it's the historical fiction with a slightly magical element, not too magical, but a little bit. And the historical fiction is done so well. All of the language used in the book, all of the description, makes you feel like you're in the 18th century. It feels like you're reading an 18th century novel, although some of the stuff in it you would not find in most 18th century novels. The characters are so alive and real. I love Angelica so much. She is silly and romantic, naive. Even though she's been a sex worker for most of her life, she is still hopelessly naive. And it's historical fiction. You feel the actual dirt of the time. People do bad things in this novel, and people also do human things in this novel, like human bodily functions. You feel like you're actually in 18th century London and the smells of 18th century London. It's a long book, but it is so brilliantly done. The next book on my list is in a similar vein. It's The Essex Serpent by Sarah. This book is set in 19th century Essex, and it's about a woman whose husband has died. She is obsessed with fossils and Mary Anning and all the new discoveries of science, dinosaurs and things, and there are rumours coming from the Essex coast of a giant serpent that's taking children, and so she goes to Essex to find out the truth of this, and she meets this vicar and his wife and her son, who is, I think, autistic. And there's so much in it. There's so much about class and science and a woman's position and religion versus science, and about freedom and nature. East Anglia Gothic, if that's a thing, like Southern Gothic, like a Gothic novel but very specific to the place in which it is set. And there's this other man who's obsessed with the main character, Clara, who's a doctor, and so he's science, and then there's the vicar who's, again, you feel like you're reading a Victorian novel, except it's things that happen that would never happen in a Victorian novel. It manages to be Gothic and have an element of the mystical and the magical while still being very visceral and real, the natural world bordering on the sublime. It's so strongly written, and again, the character's Clara. I love her. I just love all, if they have a good female character in a book, I'm like almost 100% there. So the next one on my list is a collection of short stories called The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. So I read this for my English A-level, and it is a collection of short stories that are retellings of fairy tales with a feminist perspective. Angela Carter is a really physical writer. There's so much in the description that is visceral and alive. The brightness of the colours and the real physicality of the people, of the characters, of the animals, the way everything feels and smells and touches. It's so alive. And it's also very clever. A lot of it's very arch, very hard to describe because it is in your face, but it's also subtle and clever at the same time. Like, you're not going to go away without realising what's going on, but there are layers to it if you choose to look for them. One of the reasons that this is on my list is because elements from it are in The Essex Serpent and are in The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock, but this is an older book and also a book that I read previous to that, and it was one of the books that helped me to find my taste. It's retellings of fairy tales, so obviously it's not real, but it's also not fantasy in the sort of classic Tolkien or princesses, fairies and dragons thing, which I'm not disparaging, but it's the humanity of the magical is something that I find so interesting, that borderline, the place where people are just sort of slipping liminal spaces between reality and fantasy, which is a lot about what fairy tales are about. The fourth book is the book that I always tell people if they ask for my favourite novel, and that is The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje. This is a novel set right at the end of World War II in Italy, in a villa on a hill, after the Nazis have retreated and the Allies have come through Italy and they've left this villa just on its own. There's a nurse from Canada, there is a man who has been burnt completely, his whole body is just a burn, and he is the English patient of the title. There is a thief from Canada who knows the nurse somehow, and a sapper who is a Sikh man from India and who is in the backyard trying to defuse a bomb. The story goes back to when the English patient was not a burnt shell of a man and his love affair with a married woman. The language in this book is incredible. The poeticism of the prose, the way everything is almost dreamlike. Compared to the viscerality of the other books I've been talking about, this book is so much more dreamlike, and its ideas and thoughts and spilling, and the images are beautiful but they're not concrete in the same way. There's a magic to the language, despite the fact that this is a historical novel grounded entirely in reality. And the way that he tells it. So what happened to this man is that he was in the English patient, is that he was in a plane, got shot down over the desert, and that's how he got dragged through the desert by Bedouins, I think. And the oral storytelling tradition of nomadic people imbues the way that Ondaatje tells this story. It feels like an oral story where characters are passing things around, passing the story. There is no clear demarcation between when they go from the perspective of the nurse to the perspective of the sapper to the perspective of the English patient to back in time with the English patient. There's no like, this is this bit and this is this bit, because it's much more organic than that, and it is so beautiful and so well done. And there are themes of identity and race and terrible things that humans can do, and it's stunning. It's just stunning. You have to read it. Fifth on my list is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I love this book. I did classics at university, so part of it was a bit of a like wanky classicist thing where you're like, oh yeah, I get that reference. I read it at university because everyone was obsessed with it at university because we were classic students. Now, mind, we were in a fairly large 1950s university in the West Country, and this is set in a small, like Victorian style college with only 6 pupils in the northeast of the States. I think it's in New England, but still, you get the references and you feel smart. But apart from that, it's so good. Like, at the beginning, you know that this group of people have killed someone, but you don't know who they've killed or why or what's going on. And the mystery unravels at the same time as you're finding out about this group of people, and everyone's terrible. Like, there are no good characters in it. Everyone's a terrible person. I don't like any of them, but you're still like obsessed with them. And I think it's because the main character is slightly an outsider who's come into this group, and he is obsessed with this group and everyone in it and their teacher. He like wants to be them so bad, and he feels so bad about not being part of this group, feeling awkward and an outsider, and he really just wants to get in, and it makes you feel obsessed with them in the same way. It's so well written and the mystery is so well done, and again the writing is like, you feel the setting so much. You feel the setting both of these posh idiots on campus, and you feel the setting of this New England winter. It's pretentious. It definitely is pretentious at times, but man, it's also taken the piss out of itself for being pretentious at the same time. I just love it. It's one of the only like mysteries that have really grabbed me in that way. If you've seen How to Get Away with Murder, like the first series of that kind of has secret history vibes a little bit. That elite group who've done something terrible. But it's less soapy than that. More pretentious, less soapy. Next is The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. This book was lent to me by one of my friends who loved it, and I always trust her taste. It's set in the Congo in the 1960s with the fall of Belgian imperialism and the independence movement and what happened after that. And it follows this family of where the father is a missionary and he brings his wife and his 4 daughters to the Congo, to this little village in the middle of nowhere where they know nothing and they have to live in a hut the way that people in that village do live. They don't know how to live in a hut. They don't know how to grow anything, and they bring like seeds from the States but nothing grows. There's also all this abundance of native food but they don't want to eat it. And each of the chapters is from a different perspective of one of the daughters, and it goes through each of them. And one of the things that's so powerful about this novel is the way that each of the voices are differentiated. And they begin all together and they end up being scattered to the wind, but still all of the voices, when you change chapters, you know whose perspective you've gone into. And I think that that's so well done and so difficult to differentiate the voices so clearly. It's also a period of history I knew nothing about, and as I've mentioned before, I find fiction a really good way to sort of start an understanding of something. Obviously it's fiction, you're not going to know all of the facts from it, but it does help you to learn some things you didn't know before. And the descriptions in this book are incredible. There's a bit where all of the ants come and they're like biting everyone. Everyone in the village has to run down to the water and get into the river. And the way it's described is so vivid and so real, and it's so incredible. It's like all confusing and there's cacophony and there are ants everywhere. So the next one on my list is also a trilogy, but I've actually only read the first 2 books in the trilogy. I still need to read the 3rd one. It is on my shelf. And that is Regeneration by Pat Barker. This is a First World War novel that's set in a psychiatric hospital for men with PTSD, or shell shock as they called it then. In this hospital, Siegfried Sassoon is there and Wilfred Owen is there, and then there's this other character who becomes the main character in the second book, and I don't know about the 3rd one. And there's also a psychologist, and the psychologist and the fictional character are kind of the main people, but then Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen are also weaved into it. And it's about mental health and war and the terrible things that war does to people, and it's also about homosexuality in the early 20th century. These are, I think they're all gay men. It's a beautiful novel. It's so much more pared back than the other novels I've been talking about. Really poignant and still. Despite there being so much in it, not a lot happens. It's just incredibly powerful and beautiful and sad. Obviously, it's a First World War novel. It's going to be sad. But it's not sad in the, oh, generals send boys over the hill and they know to come back, oh dear, how sad. It's much more internal, and the destruction of war is really faced in a way that it is not in a lot of the war fiction that we have. Number 8 on my list is Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. This won the Man Booker in 2017, and I think I read it in 2017. And it's another historical fiction. It's about Abraham Lincoln and the night that his son died whilst they were having a party. And it's also really weird. The body of the boy gets taken to this cemetery, and then his spirit kind of comes out of his body into the Bardo. Bardo is a Tibetan Buddhist idea of the liminal space between life and death, where you go before you pass on or reincarnate. And in the Bardo, he meets all these other people who are of 19th century American life. So the books that are written real life are snippets of sources, like historical sources of what happened at this party. And some of them are real historical sources because it's the Lincolns and people were writing letters and writing diaries and writing about them. And some of them are made up to sort of enhance the story, but it's a really clever way of telling a historical story and giving lots of different perspectives, because this thing happened at a party, so there were lots of people there, so there are lots of things that were going on, and that also gives you context because they are talking about from their perspective what happened, so it gives you a sort of broad overview. And then the bits that are written in straight prose are the bits that are in the Bardo, but they're written from the perspective of a few of these different ghosts. And a lot of weird different things happen, things that can only happen because they're physical spirits, and a bit of an idea of what going on is like, but not completely, because the character who's sort of half gone on and then come back hasn't gone all the way, so we can't tell you the whole thing. But you also don't know if that's true or not, or if that's what happens for everyone, or if it's just what happened for him. And sometimes certain people go on throughout the whole novel. There's such a broad array of characters, and they're all different settings. They're all different people from 19th century America, and there's stuff about race, and there's stuff about class, and there's stuff about gender in it. Unmarked grave with buried slaves in, and they come and talk as well, and you hear from them. It is a weird novel. It is one that is sort of experimental and possibly difficult to get on with, but I got on with it. I listened to the audiobook, which has a full cast of characters. I don't know if that was more helpful that way, but I did fall in love with it. Number 9 on my list is Atonement by Ian McEwan. I've read a few Ian McEwan books and I didn't like any of them except Atonement. Atonement is about trying to make something right by rewriting the story. So in the 1930s we're in a house and there's 2 sisters and a family friend and some children of family friends that have been invited to this party, and there's also the gardener's son, I think he's the gardener's son or the groundskeeper's son, who the family paid to put through school, and he's coming to the party. He's been invited to the party as well. He and the daughter of the house have a passion for one another, and the daughter, the younger daughter, sees 2 things at the party, and she's not really sure what she's seen, and she makes an accusation. It's a false accusation made in bitterness and anger and without a full understanding of the repercussions of what she's accusing, but also wanting to split people apart. And we find out what happens to their lives, and there are 2 endings. The ending that she's rewritten and the real ending is devastating. It goes through the Second World War and what happens to them during the characters are so real and flawed, vulnerable, difficult people, and the writing is so incredibly beautiful, and the setting and the scenery and the film is stunning too. Such a clever exploration of guilt and what guilt can do to you, and also what spite can do, what spite did to instigate this problem, and the repercussions of your small actions that can spread so far. The final one on this list is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I think the mistake that a lot of people make when they read this is that they think it's a romance novel, as in a falling in love romance novel, a Jane Austen style romance novel, or maybe a bit more epic than that, but a romance as in 2 people meet and fall in love. It's not. It's a romance novel as in the Romantic period, which is the period in which the Brontes grew up, and the period in which this novel is set, even though it was written 50 years or so later. It's kind of set during the height of the Romantic period. An exploration of character, an exploration of flaws, the beauty of nature, the sublime. It is both gothic and romantic at the same time, and I love it. I don't think you need to go into it feeling like this is supposed to be people that you'll root for, people that you'll love, you want them to be together and a happy ending. It's not like that. It's dark, and it's about the terrible things that people can do to each other, and it's about what happens, the consequences of hurting children, how someone can grow up if their childhood has been horrible, and whether you can change your destiny. And yes, they do fall in love, and there is romance in that sense in it too, but it's not meant to be, oh, I love this, you want these people to be together. The Moor is one of the main characters in this novel, and the descriptions of setting, so well done. I can see why people are a bit disappointed with the second half, with the younger people, but that's part of the idea of this cycle of abuse and changing your destiny. Those are all my favourite books of all time, my childhood favourites and my favourites that I read as an adult. I know that it's not a very diverse list. It is mostly white, mostly women, mostly from the UK. That is where I live and who I am. And so it's understandable why that happened. It's also, considering our publishing industry, understandable why that happened. That doesn't mean it should continue to happen, and that is why I'm making an effort to read more diversely this year. So hopefully some of my favourite books of all time in the future will not just be white women. Thank you for watching, and if you want to share your favourite books of all time in the comments below, I would love to read them. Thank you. Bye bye.